across British Columbia and under the banner of reconciliation. British Columbians who are not Indigenous are starting to be shut out of public spaces, to see major resource and infrastructure projects delayed and canceled, are becoming unable to read signs on streets and gathering spots because they've been renamed using characters that are not found in our official languages, and are even starting to see their property rights be chipped away at, as seen by a recent Supreme Court ruling that grants Aboriginal title to First Nations on Vancouver Island over a significant portion of privately held land in Richmond. And while that unsettling decision is being appealed by the province, there's still a Trojan horse of a law rearing its ugly head that, once fully implemented, will create a systemic loss of autonomy for British Columbians, communities, their land use, and their democracies. I'm Drea Humphrey with Rebel News, bringing you an important call to action to help unite British Columbians instead of divide them, by joining our one-click email campaign demanding that the provincial government put an end to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act at stopundrip.com. In 2019, by a vote of every single MLA present, British Columbia radically became the first jurisdiction in the world to take the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, and adopt it here as law. The UN's UNDRIP is completely aspirational, by the way. It's what that foreign globalist entity envisions is best for the rights of Indigenous peoples, not all people. Yet our legislators took that framework and binded it for all British Columbians. A couple of years later, Canada also radically adopted UNDRIP, meaning our country now houses 2 of what I believe are only 3 jurisdictions in the entire world to do so, with Bolivia being the 3rd. Except there's a significant difference between what the feds passed versus what BC did. And while I have concerns about both, Canada's UNDRIP Act says the federal government must take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the Declaration, but by way of a co-developed action plan. A policy roadmap of sorts, one that they came up with in 2023. It lists close to 200 changes they'd like to make over the following 5 years to work towards UNDRIP. But because it's policy, the feds can slow that down, they can change it, or even shelf parts of it without having to amend an act, making it easier for concerned citizens to call on them to do so. BC, on the other hand, well, we went all in. Yes, they worked on an action plan, but that doesn't change their decision to become legally obligated to make all provincial laws consistent with UNDRIP on an immediate and ongoing basis. That's all laws, and not in the best interest of all British Columbians. And here's why. If you haven't already done so, I recommend you go ahead and read the UN's UNDRIP. I've linked it for you in the written article for this report, which you can find in the description box below. It's not long. It's got about 46 points across 20 some odd pages. You can handle it. But just to give you a few examples right now, here's Article 19. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. This is very veto-friendly. It gives Indigenous groups potential power to block decisions like municipal bylaws, local infrastructure, or community plans before any public consultation happens. Not only is that a form of red tape you may never be able to cut through, it makes 95% of the population, the non-Indigenous population, treated as second-class decision makers in their own province. And what about Article 26 here? Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used as acquired. Newsflash, there's currently 200 First Nations in British Columbia claiming 100% of British Columbia's land, and much of those claims are conflicting with each other's. If they can't even decide whose land is whose, what on earth will that mean for the majority of British Columbians living here? Perhaps something like this.
It is time that Canada realizes that they are on stolen land. It has to happen in a way where the government has to give up things now. They have to give up some lands and just give them back to the First Nations.
So how much land and where would that land be when you say it should be given back?
All of this land.
So the whole country?
The whole country.
In Article 28, it reads that Indigenous peoples have the right to redress by means that can include restitution, or when this is not possible, just fair and equitable compensation for the lands, territories, and resources which have been confiscated, taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. That's the ticket, my friends. Not just for demanding land back, but also for compensation, more compensation and settlements than many bands have already gotten, and for places that have existed in our communities for generations, and ones that Indigenous tribes fought over with each other before that. DRIPA is a can of worms that honestly, if our government was so woke enough to pass it and the people are too distracted or politically correct to try and correct it, then why wouldn't band governments rip the lid right off to see what they can get out of it? Haida Gwaii is a good example of where this can all go, thanks to the provincial government's reconciliation framework that we've locked ourselves into with DRIPA. The provincial government handed over shared governance of lands and resources to the Haida Gwaii Nation after DRIPA influenced their decision to do so, meaning thousands of non-Haida British Columbians are now partly ruled by politicians from a band government that they cannot even vote for. Or more recently, where I've also been covering and will continue to cover what's unfolding, where many in a small community called Okanagan Falls feel blindsided to find out that after they voted to be incorporated, the neighboring Osoyoos First Nation is now calling for Crown land to be removed from their footprint. They want to change their name and possibly their street names. And they also want to be notified anytime any type of development is about to happen. And thanks to DRIPA, they're probably going to get everything they ask for. And what's to stop them from asking for more, or the other neighboring band in Penticton to start asking for demands? And it's unsurprising that BC's socialist NDP government with its Green Party coalition are all DRIPA cheerleaders. I mean, what more could we expect from a government whose Burnaby East MLA Rohini Aurora thinks this about the majority of British Columbians?
Indigenous people, including myself, use the term settler, uninvited guest, or for white folks who self-describe as colonizer. It reminds us that we are here because of a colonial system that still impacts Indigenous communities today. I am a settler. I was born here, but my family came from India through Canada's colonial immigration system, a country and system built on the displacement of Indigenous peoples. That truth doesn't exclude anyone. True reconciliation means recognizing that Canada was built on the lands and suffering of Indigenous peoples. It's not about blame, it's about a shared responsibility. It's not about division, it's about building honest, respectful relationships so that we can chart a new path forward together. And one that centers First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous people. When we self-refer as settlers, it's a signal to Indigenous people that we understand the history of colonization. And I urge all members here to do the same.
Although BC Conservative leader John Rustad, like David Eby, was one of the MLAs to have voted in DRIPA, the party has raised red flags about DRIPA, even calling for BC to repeal UNDRIP when the NDP tried to rush the passing of the controversial proposed Land Act.
What is essentially happening now under UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, is already a veto because the government will not move forward anything unless they have consensus. So now what they're doing is they're codifying that. bringing it in terms of joint decision making so that basically nothing can move, nothing can happen on the landscape, hunting decisions, recreational decisions, resource decisions, nothing will be able to happen unless you now have the approval through the First Nation process. And so it opens up, quite frankly, I hate to say this, but it opens up for potential for corruption.
Closer to last year's election, however, mid-campaign, Rustad backpedaled from that position and stated that the party would keep DRIPA and use UNDRIP as a guiding principle unless later on it became problematic to do so. The BC Conservatives Party House Speaker, Chilliwack Cultus Lake MLA A'aliya Warbus, gave a window view of what that likely means for the party when she was discussing the since-passed Bill 14 renewable energy projects.
There needs to be a recognition that it be afforded the time it takes to have the alignment with DRIPA, and that Indigenous leaders are going to be on side with any changes to legislation that's going to affect them. That's very clear.
BC's newest sitting party, 1BC's leader Dallas Brody, however, has remained unapologetically opposed to DRIPA. She didn't mince words about that when she said this.
Hi, Dallas Brody here. In 2019, David Eby, John Rustad, and every other MLA in the legislature passed the most racist and radical law in British Columbia's history. It's called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, more commonly known as DRIPA. DRIPA entrenches the racial divisions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous British Columbians. How does it do that? Well, first, DRIPA transfers public and private lands to Indigenous bands who are not accountable to BC laws, to BC voters, or even to their own members. Second, DRIPA gives veto powers to BC's 200-plus bands over government decisions, blocking approvals for resource development, infrastructure, and other areas of our economy. Third, DRIPA dictates that all BC laws, all laws, be rewritten to conform with Indigenous laws, even though many of these laws are unwritten myths, cultural practices that are not compatible with a democratic, rules-based society. DRIPA is the reason why Wet'suwet'en chiefs expelled law-abiding workers from the LNG Canada Pipeline Project. DRIPA is the reason why Haida leaders demolished the homes of citizens recently who had committed no crime. DRIPA is the reason why provincial parks are being closed to the non-Indigenous public. Every British Columbian should have the same rights and the same opportunities, including Indigenous British Columbians living in poverty on reserves without charter rights or the ability to own private property. I call on David Eby, John Rustad, and every other British Columbia to join me in demanding an end to racist laws in BC. To begin, let's drop DRIPA.
The bottom line is, reconciliation is supposed to be about creating mutually respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, aka Canadians. It's not about imposing a two-tiered society, giving the majority of Canadians no say, no voice, and no hope. So let's show David Eby and every party in the BC legislature what inclusivity actually means by respectfully demanding that they drop DRIPA today. And you can do so in seconds by joining our email campaign addressed to all party leaders and their ministers with influence over this matter by respectfully demanding that they put an end to DRIPA at our special website called stopundrip.com. We're all Canadians and we should all be treated as such. Take action against DRIPA at stopundrip.com.